1856. Black Cypress Plantation collapsed in a single morning. Its owner in irons, its land seized, its ledgers branded fraudulent by the same courts that once protected him. No uprising, no fire, no missing bodies. White creditors demanded answers, and the only name whispered was a boy who had never held a whip, never signed a paper, never spoke above a murmur. Years earlier, that same plantation had promoted an enslaved child to run errands through its halls, letting him carry keys, messages, and numbers no one bothered to guard. Edmund Hale believed ownership made him untouchable, believed debt could be hidden, believed intelligence had a color. By the time the sheriff read the charges aloud, Hale finally understood the irony. The plantation hadn't been attacked. It had been understood, and no one could explain how an enslaved boy had done it. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The sun rose pale and cold over the Mississippi Delta, casting long shadows across land that would soon belong to someone else. Sheriff Caleb Morton arrived at dawn. His wagon rattled up the oak-lined drive to Black Cypress Plantation, followed by 3 more carriages, witnesses to legal proceedings, creditors ready to claim what they were owed, men with leather satchels and precise handwriting who understood money better than mercy. Morton dismounted slowly. He was a methodical man. Everything he did followed proper procedure. He checked his pocket watch, pulled a folded document from his coat, and walked to the front steps of the main house, where Edmund Hale stood waiting. Hale's face was red. His jaw trembled. "This is unlawful," Hale said. His voice carried across the front yard, where enslaved people had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual presence of strangers at such an early hour. "I demand you turn back immediately. I am a respected member of this community. My family has owned this land for 2 generations." Morton unfolded the document. "Mr. Edmund Hale, by order of the Circuit Court of Mississippi, this property is hereby seized to satisfy outstanding debts totaling—" "Lies!" Hale's shout echoed. "Every word is lies and conspiracy." Morton continued reading without pause. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. Debts totaling $47,000 in defaulted loans, fraudulent insurance claims, and unpaid promissory notes. All assets, including land, livestock, structures, and human property, are to be inventoried and sold at public auction to satisfy creditors. A murmur rippled through the crowd of enslaved people. Some stood near the cabins. Others had been walking toward the fields when the carriages arrived. Now they simply waited, faces carefully empty of expression. One of the creditors, a banker named Whitmore, stepped forward. He carried a ledger thick as a Bible. "We've been patient, Hale. 2 years of promises, 2 years of excuses." "I have money coming," Hale said. His hands shook. "The cotton futures—" "There are no cotton futures," Whitmore said. "There's no cotton. Your fields produced half their usual yield last season. The season before that, your gin broke down 3 times. You borrowed against next year's harvest to pay this year's debts, then borrowed against the year after that. The numbers don't work anymore. Someone has sabotaged me." Hale's voice cracked. "Someone has poisoned my reputation, spread lies to my creditors, turned my own workers against me." "Your workers?" Morton looked up from his document. "You mean the people you enslaved and brutalized?" Hale's face went purple. "I treated them with Christian charity. I fed them, housed them, gave them purpose." "You sold 3 families last month to cover gambling debts," Whitmore interrupted. "We have the receipts." The enslaved people watched in silence. A woman held her daughter close. An old man leaned on a walking stick, his expression unreadable. Young children pressed against their mother's legs, sensing something important was happening, but not understanding what. Morton gestured to his deputies. "Begin the inventory." Men spread across the property with notebooks and measuring rods. They counted barrels in the storehouse, examined the cotton gin, walked through the main house, opening drawers and cabinets. One deputy emerged from the barn leading a horse. Another made notes about the smokehouse contents. Hale followed them, protesting at every turn. "That furniture belonged to my grandmother. You cannot simply— Those silver candlesticks are family heirlooms. This is theft, legal theft, sanctioned by corrupt officials." "Everything goes to auction," Morton said, "unless you can produce $47,000 by week's end." Hale stopped walking. His shoulders sagged. By mid-morning, townspeople had gathered along the road. Word spread fast in small communities. The collapse of a plantation was rare enough to draw spectators, people who came to witness wealth unmade, to see power crumble into dust and legal documents. "Heard it was a slave boy done it," someone whispered. The rumor moved through the crowd like wind through cotton fields. "Can't be true. How would a slave bring down a whole plantation? Smartest boy anyone ever saw, they say. Could barely read out loud but understood numbers like magic. That's foolishness. Slaves don't understand business." "Then how'd this happen?" No one had an answer. By noon, the inventory was complete. Morton posted the auction notice on the main house door. Creditors returned to their carriages, satisfied that procedure had been followed. Hale sat on his front steps, head in his hands, muttering about betrayal and conspiracy. The enslaved people remained near the cabins, unsure what came next. Some would be sold. Some might be freed by court order if no buyers emerged. All of them understood that their lives were about to change again, shifted by forces they had no control over, or so it seemed to those who watched. As evening approached, the crowd dispersed. Townspeople returned to their homes with new gossip to share. Creditors drove back to town, ledgers balanced and accounts settled. Morton filed his paperwork, another task completed, another piece of property seized and redistributed according to law. The sun set over Black Cypress Plantation, painting the sky orange and red, and in that fading light, the story turned backward. 14 years earlier, a boy stood in the same spot where Hale now sat defeated. The boy was 11 years old. His name was Isaiah Finch. He had just been assigned to work in the main house, a position that seemed like fortune, but would become something else entirely. The beginning of a plan so patient and precise that no one would see it until the day everything fell apart. The morning came dark and cold, that particular delta darkness before dawn when the air felt thick enough to touch. Isaiah woke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin, not the usual overseer's boots, but lighter steps, purposeful and quick. The door opened without warning. Isaiah Finch. Mrs. Ruth Hale stood in the doorway, a lantern held high. Her face was pale in the lamplight, her expression businesslike. "Come with me." "Bring nothing." Isaiah's mother gripped his shoulder once, briefly, then let go. No words passed between them. Words invited attention, and attention invited punishment. Isaiah stood and followed Mrs. Hale into the pre-dawn darkness, his bare feet finding familiar paths between the cabins. They walked toward the main house, that white structure that loomed over the plantation like a judge over a courtroom. Isaiah had been inside twice before, once to carry firewood when he was 8, once to help move furniture when he was 10. Both times he'd kept his eyes down and his movements slow, understanding even then that speed suggested capability, and capability invited expectations he couldn't safely meet. Mrs. Hale led him through the back entrance into the kitchen. Heat from the stove made the room feel close. An older enslaved woman named Dinah was already working, preparing breakfast. She glanced at Isaiah, but said nothing. "You'll work as a house errand boy," Mrs. Hale said. She spoke the way she did everything, efficiently, without warmth or cruelty, just simple transmission of necessary information. "You'll carry messages, fetch items, run errands to town when needed. You'll serve at meals when we have guests. You'll keep yourself clean and presentable at all times." "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah said quietly. "You can read?" "A little, ma'am." "Not good." This was true in a specific way. He could read aloud only slowly, stumbling over words, appearing to sound out letters with great effort. But he could read silently with perfect comprehension. The difference between the two skills had kept him alive. "You'll learn what you need to learn," Mrs. Hale said. "Dinah will show you your duties. Be useful and quiet. Nothing more." She left without further instruction. Dinah handed Isaiah a broom. "Start by sweeping the dining room, then the hallway. Move slow but thorough. Don't break nothing. Don't touch nothing that ain't your task to touch. And don't never look nobody in the eye unless they specifically tell you to." Isaiah nodded and took the broom. The dining room was larger than the entire cabin where his family slept. A long table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs with carved backs. Paintings hung on the walls, landscapes and portraits of stern-faced white people. A grandfather clock ticked in the corner, marking time with mechanical precision. Isaiah swept slowly, methodically. He moved the way he'd learned to move in the fields, like someone whose mind was occupied only with the immediate task, nothing more. But while his hands pushed the broom, his eyes recorded everything. A stack of papers sat on the side table. The top page showed columns of numbers and what looked like a contract. He couldn't read it from this distance, but he noted its position, the handwriting, the official seal at the bottom. Footsteps approached from the hallway. Isaiah kept sweeping, eyes on the floor. Edmund Hale entered with another white man, someone Isaiah didn't recognize. They spoke in the casual tones of people who believed they weren't being heard or didn't care if they were. "The Memphis buyer is firm at 12 cents per pound," the stranger said. "But he wants delivery by October, not November." "Can't be done," Hale replied. "We're already behind from last season's equipment troubles. I'd need to borrow against next year's crop to hire additional pickers." "Then borrow. You've got the land as collateral. The land is already leveraged for the gin repairs and the livestock purchases. Then leverage something else." They moved past Isaiah as if he were furniture. He swept the same spot 3 times while they continued to the study, their voices fading behind a closed door. Dinah appeared in the doorway. "Dining room done?" "Yes, ma'am." "Hallway next. Then you sit in the kitchen until someone calls for you." The day continued in similar fashion. Isaiah carried a letter to the overseer's cottage. He fetched a book from the upstairs library for Mrs. Hale. She specified which shelf, which position, because clearly he couldn't be trusted to find it by title. He brought water to the study where Mr. Hale worked on ledgers, entering the room silently and leaving the same way. Each task gave him access to new spaces, new conversations, new fragments of information. In the library, he glimpsed a newspaper left open to commodity prices. In the study, he heard Hale cursing about insurance premiums. In the hallway, he overheard Mrs. Hale discussing household budgets with Dinah, mentioning debts to the general store. He absorbed it all while appearing to absorb nothing. At dinner, the Hales ate while Isaiah stood against the wall, ready to fetch additional items if needed. Before the meal began, Hale led a prayer, thanking God for their prosperity, their health, their righteous stewardship over those God had placed under their care. Isaiah kept his head bowed and his face blank. After dinner, he carried dishes to the kitchen. Dinah showed him where to sleep. A small space off the kitchen, barely larger than a closet, with a thin pallet on the floor. Better than the cabin in some ways. Warmer, closer to food, but also more isolated, separated from his mother and the other people who'd known him since birth. He lay down as full darkness settled over the plantation. The house creaked and settled. Somewhere above, footsteps crossed the floor. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times. Isaiah closed his eyes and began to replay the day. 12 cents per pound. October delivery. Land already leveraged. Gin repairs. Livestock purchases. Insurance premiums. Debts to the general store. The numbers arranged themselves in his mind like pieces of a puzzle. He couldn't see the full picture yet, but he understood something fundamental. This plantation ran on borrowed money and borrowed time. The wealth was performance, not reality. Leveraged. That meant using something you owned to borrow money against it. If you couldn't pay back the loan, whoever gave you the money could take what you'd leveraged. The land is already leveraged. Isaiah turned onto his side, pulling the thin blanket closer. He thought about the contract on the side table, the official seal at the bottom. He thought about Mrs. Hale's discussion of household debts. He thought about the way Mr. Hale's voice had tightened when talking about next year's crop. The information swirled and connected, forming patterns he didn't yet fully understand, but knew were important. Outside, an owl called. The sound carried across empty fields, where Isaiah would no longer work, at least not in the same way. He was 11 years old. He had just gained access to the center of the system that owned him, and while everyone around him saw only a slow, simple boy, learning to carry messages and sweep floors, Isaiah Finch was beginning to understand exactly how plantations lived and how they died. The next morning arrived with the same pre-dawn cold, the same mechanical progression from darkness into gray light. Isaiah woke on his pallet in the kitchen closet, his body already learning the rhythms of house service rather than fieldwork. Dinah appeared before the sun fully rose. Study needs cleaning before Mr. Hale meets his visitors. Dust the shelves. Empty the ash from the fireplace. Don't touch nothing on the desk. Isaiah took the cleaning supplies and entered the study while it was still empty. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held leather-bound books with gold lettering on their spines. A large desk dominated one corner, covered with documents arranged in careful stacks. He worked slowly, appearing to struggle with the simple task of dusting. His cloth moved across each shelf with deliberate inefficiency, but his eyes moved faster than his hands, scanning book titles, noting which ones had been recently handled based on dust patterns. Agricultural Futures and Cotton Markets. The Moral Foundations of Christian Stewardship. Mississippi Commercial Law. 3rd edition. The ledger sat open on the desk, displaying 2 pages of neat columns. Isaiah dusted the shelf nearest the desk, close enough to see the numbers, but appearing focused only on his task. Footsteps approached. Isaiah moved away from the desk, working on a bookshelf across the room. Edmund Hale entered with 2 white men. One was thin and sharp-featured, carrying a leather folder. The other was heavy-set, his expensive coat straining at the buttons. "Gentlemen," Hale said warmly, "please, sit." The thin man got straight to business. "Mr. Hale, we've reviewed your account. The payment you made last month covered the interest, but left the principal untouched for the 3rd consecutive quarter. Cotton prices have been unpredictable," Hale replied smoothly. "The harvest will settle all outstanding balances. You said that last year. Last year we had equipment failures that reduced yield by nearly 20%. This year we've made the necessary repairs." The heavy-set man leaned forward. "The bank isn't interested in excuses, Mr. Hale. We're interested in payment schedules that reflect actual capacity, not optimistic projections." Isaiah continued dusting, moving like someone whose thoughts went no deeper than the task at hand. The men's voices washed over him as if he were deaf to their meaning. "I'm prepared to offer additional collateral," Hale said. His voice had shifted, still confident, but with an edge underneath, like a blade wrapped in cloth. "What additional collateral? The land is already leveraged. The equipment is mortgaged. What exactly do you propose?" "Chattel." The thin man made a note in his folder. "How many?" "Enough to cover the shortfall." Isaiah's hands kept moving. Dust cloth across leather spines. Slow. Methodical. Thoughtless. "We'll need an inventory and appraisal," the heavy-set man said. "Young males in prime condition fetch the best prices. Families are harder to move unless you're willing to separate them. Whatever proves necessary." They discussed numbers, dollar amounts, interest rates, payment schedules. Isaiah absorbed every word while appearing to absorb nothing. After 20 minutes, the men left. Hale sat alone at his desk for several minutes, staring at the ledger. Then he called out, "Boy, fetch me coffee." "Yes, sir." Isaiah left the study and walked to the kitchen, where Dinah already had coffee prepared. He carried it back on a small tray, entering quietly and placing it on the desk exactly where Dinah had instructed him to place all items, within easy reach, but not touching any papers. Hale didn't acknowledge him. Isaiah left without a word. The weeks that followed established a routine that became as predictable as the clock's chiming. Each morning, Isaiah cleaned the study. Each afternoon, he ran errands, to the overseer's cottage, to the gin house, occasionally to town. Each evening he served at dinner and listened to Hale pray over meals that cost more than most enslaved families saw in a year. The routine created familiarity, and familiarity created invisibility. Within 2 weeks, the Hales stopped noticing when Isaiah entered a room. Within a month, they discussed business matters in front of him with the same freedom they'd discussed them in front of the furniture. Isaiah cleaned the study every morning and memorized the ledger entries that changed from day to day. He couldn't read the handwriting quickly, but he didn't need to. He memorized the numbers' positions, their relationships to each other, the way certain columns grew while others shrank. Income from cotton sales, decreasing month over month. Expenses for equipment, seed, labor management, increasing. Outstanding debts to Memphis Bank and Trust, growing. Interest payments, consuming larger percentages of available capital. He served at dinners where Hale entertained other plantation owners and absorbed their conversations about crop yields, market fluctuations, political debates over tariffs and trade. He stood against the wall during prayer and heard Hale thank God for prosperity that the ledgers proved was disappearing. He carried letters to town and noted which ones went to creditors, which to cotton buyers, which to insurance companies. The pattern became clear through repetition. Hale was writing more letters, asking for extensions, renegotiations, additional time. The plantation looked prosperous. The main house remained clean and well-maintained. The Hales dressed in fine clothes and attended church every Sunday. But underneath the performance, the structure was rotting from financial strain. Isaiah understood this not through any single revelation, but through accumulated fragments. Numbers from the ledger, conversations between creditors, the increasing frequency of tense discussions behind closed study doors. The plantation survives on debt. Everything visible is purchased with borrowed money. If the debts can't be paid, everything collapses. This realization didn't arrive as a sudden insight. It built slowly, piece by piece, until one morning, while dusting the same shelves he dusted every morning, Isaiah simply knew it as completely as he knew his own name. The plantation was already dying. It just didn't know it yet. On an evening in late autumn, Isaiah served dinner while the Hales entertained a cotton buyer from New Orleans. The conversation ranged across multiple topics: politics, weather, the quality of this season's crop. Then, casually, as if discussing livestock, "I may have some prime hands available next spring," Hale said. "Young, healthy, trainable, if you know anyone in the market." "Always someone in the market," the buyer replied. "What are we talking about? 5? 10? Haven't finalized the inventory yet. But there's a boy, about 11 or 12 now. Sharp enough for housework. Should fetch a decent price by next year." Mrs. Hale added more potatoes to the buyer's plate. "More coffee, Isaiah." "Yes, ma'am." Isaiah walked to the kitchen, his movements unhurried, his face empty of expression. He poured coffee from the pot on the stove, his hands steady. Next spring. Within a year. They're planning to sell me. He carried the coffee back to the dining room and refilled the buyer's cup, then returned to his position against the wall. The conversation continued. The buyer laughed at something Hale said. Mrs. Hale rang the small bell that meant Isaiah should clear the first course. He collected plates with careful slowness, his mind already calculating. Not how to escape. Escape was nearly impossible and would endanger his mother, but something else. Something that had been forming in fragments since that first morning in the study, now suddenly sharpened by immediate necessity. They need to sell me because they need money. They need money because the plantation is failing. The plantation is failing because it's built on debt it can't repay. Isaiah carried the plates to the kitchen. Through the window, full darkness had settled over the fields. In the distance, cabin lights flickered where enslaved families gathered after another day's labor. He had less than a year, maybe only months, depending on how quickly Hale's creditors demanded payment. In that time, he needed to understand not just how the plantation was failing, but how to make sure it failed completely, in a way that destroyed it beyond recovery, in a way that looked like natural collapse, rather than deliberate sabotage. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times. Isaiah returned to the dining room to serve dessert, his face showing nothing but patient obedience. 2 years passed. Isaiah turned 13 in the winter of 1844, then 14 the following year. The seasons marked time through cycles of labor that repeated with mechanical precision. Spring planting, summer cultivation, autumn harvest, winter preparation. Cotton dominated everything: the fields, the economy, the conversations in Hale's study, the future of everyone who lived on Black Cypress land. Isaiah grew taller but remained thin, his frame suggesting fragility that concealed wiry strength. His face kept the same careful blankness it had learned that first day in the big house. He moved through his routines with practiced slowness, never volunteering information, never appearing to understand more than his immediate tasks required. But the routines gave him access. 2 years of cleaning the study meant 2 years of watching numbers shift in ledgers. 2 years of serving at dinner meant 2 years of hearing creditors make increasingly sharp demands. 2 years of running errands meant 2 years of observing how information moved between the plantation, the town, and the wider commercial network that sustained the cotton economy. The pattern became clearer with each passing season. Black Cypress Plantation was sinking. Not dramatically, not obviously, but steadily, inevitably, like a boat taking on water too slowly for passengers to notice, until the deck was already awash. Hale borrowed more money to cover existing debts. He sold equipment, then bought cheaper replacements on credit. He reduced rations for enslaved workers while increasing his own household expenses to maintain appearances of prosperity. The ledger showed the truth in numbers that grew more desperate each quarter, but the plantation's exterior remained polished, its owner projecting confidence he could no longer afford. Isaiah absorbed all of it, not through dramatic discoveries but through patient accumulation. The same way water wears down stone. Each overheard conversation added detail. Each glimpsed document provided context. Each season's repetition revealed patterns that would have been invisible in isolation, but became obvious over time. By age 14, Isaiah understood the plantation's financial structure better than most of the men who loaned Hale money. He knew which debts took priority, which creditors would accept delays, which aspects of the operation generated actual profit versus merely creating the illusion of productivity. He knew the difference between what Hale told his creditors and what the numbers actually showed. But knowledge alone wasn't enough. He needed something else, something he couldn't get from ledgers or overheard business meetings. He needed to understand how information traveled, how rumors started, how white men decided what to believe when different sources contradicted each other. For that, he needed help. The kind of help that wouldn't ask questions he couldn't answer safely. Aunt Millie worked in the laundry house, a squat wooden building behind the main house where enslaved women boiled, scrubbed, and pressed the Haleses' clothing and linens. She was old, maybe 60 or 70, her face deeply lined and her hands permanently reddened from lye soap. Most enslaved people on the plantation had been sold at least once. Aunt Millie had been sold 4 times that anyone could verify, maybe more that she didn't discuss. She knew things, not from reading or listening at doors, but from decades of watching how white people behaved when they thought no one important was observing. She understood the social mechanics of rumor, the way information flowed through church congregations and business associations and family networks. Isaiah began finding excuses to visit the laundry house, delivering messages, collecting pressed shirts, tasks that gave him reasons to be there without drawing attention. Aunt Millie noticed but said nothing for weeks. Then one afternoon when no one else was present, she spoke while folding sheets. "You're mighty careful where you step, boy." Isaiah kept his face neutral. "Ma'am?" Like someone walking on ice, testing each step before putting weight down. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched while Aunt Millie worked, her hands moving through practiced motions that required no conscious thought. "Got something you want to ask?" she said finally. "Been waiting on it for near a month now." Isaiah glanced toward the door, confirming they were alone. When he spoke, his voice stayed quiet. "How do white folks decide what's true?" Aunt Millie's hands paused briefly, then resumed folding. "That's a peculiar question. If someone tells them 2 different things about the same matter, how do they choose which one to believe?" She studied him with eyes that had seen more than Isaiah could imagine. "Depends on who's doing the telling. Preacher says one thing, merchant says another, they'll likely believe the preacher. Unless money's involved, then they believe whoever protects their wallet. What if they hear something from multiple people? Does that make it more true? Makes it more believable. Truth and believable ain't always the same thing." She set down the folded sheet and picked up another. "Why you asking?" Isaiah chose his words with the same care he used for everything. "Trying to understand how things work. How decisions get made." "Decisions about what?" "Everything." Aunt Millie was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're smarter than you pretend to be. Known that for a while now. Question is what you plan on doing with all that smartness." Isaiah met her gaze directly for the first time. "Haven't decided yet." She returned to her work. "Well, when you do decide, remember something. White folks believe what confirms what they already suspect. You want them believing something, you don't tell them direct. You let them overhear it, let them discover it themselves. Then they think it was their own idea, and they'll defend it like scripture." Over the following months, Isaiah tested the principle. Small things at first, leaving certain documents visible when he knew visitors would be in the study. Timing his movements so he'd arrive with coffee exactly when conversations reached critical points. Asking questions that seemed innocent but prompted men to explain things they'd otherwise keep private. "Mr. Hale, sir? Should I dust these papers or leave them be?" And Hale would glance over, see insurance documents, and either confirm they could be moved or, more usefully, make some comment to his guest about the insurance company's unreasonable rates, providing information Isaiah hadn't asked for but desperately needed. Aunt Millie never asked what he was doing with the information, but she'd occasionally mention things, which merchants were in financial trouble, which church members had stopped tithing, which families were quietly selling possessions, information that seemed random but always proved useful later. By the spring of 1846, shortly after Isaiah's 14th birthday, he'd accumulated enough knowledge to understand not just how Black Cyprus was failing, but how to accelerate that failure in ways that would look natural, inevitable, like simple misfortune rather than deliberate intervention. He could run. Others had tried, some successfully. Most not. Running meant leaving his mother, leaving everyone he knew, living in constant fear of capture. Running meant becoming a fugitive in a country where his very existence outside ownership was illegal. Or he could stay, not as a victim waiting for sale, but as an architect of something else entirely. One evening, Isaiah stood in the quarters between his family's cabin and the laundry house. The spring air carried the smell of cook fires and turned earth from fields being prepared for planting. In the distance, the big house glowed with lamplight, its windows showing the Hales moving through rooms purchased with money they didn't have. Isaiah made his decision. He wouldn't run from the system. He would dismantle it. Samuel Pike arrived on a Tuesday morning in June, when Isaiah was 15. The river trader came twice yearly, sometimes 3 times if the cotton market demanded faster movement of goods. He brought news from New Orleans, Memphis, and the smaller landings between. He carried information about prices, about which plantations were expanding, and which were quietly selling off slaves to stay solvent. He knew who was buying, who was selling, and, most importantly, who was lying about their financial position. Pike was a broad man with sun-weathered skin and hands stained permanently dark from handling cotton bales and tobacco crates. He wore practical clothes rather than gentleman's finery, and he spoke with the blunt efficiency of someone who measured time in terms of river miles and cargo weight. Isaiah was cleaning the front hall when Pike's wagon arrived. He watched through the window as Hale emerged to greet the trader, both men shaking hands with the cautious cordiality of business associates who needed each other but didn't particularly like one another. "Isaiah, Mrs." Hale called from the parlor. "Coffee and biscuits for Mr. Hale and his guest. Bring it to the study." "Yes, ma'am." He prepared the tray with deliberate slowness, timing his arrival to coincide with the moment when Pike would be settling into his chair, when the initial pleasantries would be transitioning into actual business discussion. The timing mattered. Too early, and they'd pause their conversation. Too late, and he'd miss the opening exchange where men often revealed more than they intended. Isaiah entered the study carrying the tray at chest height, eyes downcast in the posture of complete invisibility that white men expected. He set the coffee pot on the side table, arranged cups, placed the biscuit plate within easy reach. His movements were practiced, automatic, requiring no conscious thought, which meant his mind could focus entirely on the conversation continuing around him. "Futures are down again," Pike was saying. "Memphis factors are offering 60 cents per pound for prime cotton, but only if delivery's guaranteed by October. Later than that, and the price drops to 55, maybe lower." Hale's voice carried forced confidence. "Black Cypress has never missed a delivery date. Plantation up in Bolivar County missed theirs last season, lost their contract entirely. Bank foreclosed within 3 months. Isaiah poured coffee into both cups. His hands moved steadily, showing no reaction to information that confirmed what the ledgers had already suggested. The market was tightening, and plantations with existing debt were becoming increasingly vulnerable. "That was poor management," Hale said. "They overextended on equipment purchases. I've been far more conservative." Pike accepted his coffee cup without acknowledging Isaiah's existence. "Conservatives wise, though I heard you took out additional credit with the Jackson Bank last fall." "Routine operation capital, nothing unusual." Pike sipped his coffee. "Jackson Bank's gotten particular about repayment schedules. Foreclosed on 2 properties this spring. Both were current on interest but couldn't make principal payments when demand letters came." Isaiah finished pouring and stepped back, standing motionless near the door in case additional service was required. His face showed nothing. His posture suggested a mind occupied with nothing more complex than waiting for instruction. But he was calculating. Pike's information about the Jackson Bank changed several assumptions. If they were calling in principal payments ahead of schedule, Hale's position was more precarious than the ledgers alone suggested. The timeline might need adjustment. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering shipping routes, warehouse fees, insurance rates. Isaiah remained perfectly still, a piece of furniture with no thoughts worth concealing. Finally, Pike stood to leave. "I'll return in September for the cotton inspection. Assuming the crop's good, we can finalize contracts then." "The crop will be excellent," Hale assured him. After Pike departed, Isaiah cleared the coffee service. As he lifted the tray, he allowed himself a single calculated question. "Mr. Hale, sir, should I prepare the guest room, in case Mr. Pike returns before September?" Hale waved the question away irritably. "He won't return early. He's heading to Natchez next, then back upriver. Won't see him again until harvest." "Yes, sir." Isaiah paused, then added with perfectly executed hesitation, "I only thought he mentioned September, but the almanac in the kitchen shows that's when the widow Talbot's note comes due, the one she took out for her husband's medical expenses before he passed." Hale's head snapped up. "What? Why would you mention the widow Talbot's note?" Isaiah made his expression confused, slightly alarmed at having caused offense. "I'm sorry, sir. I only noticed because her son delivers our lamp oil, and I wondered if we should arrange for payment to be earlier in case she needs the funds. I didn't mean—" "Stop talking." Hale stared at him with sudden, sharp attention that Isaiah had deliberately provoked. "How do you know about the widow Talbot's note?" I must have heard it mentioned, sir. I apologize if I spoke out of turn." Hale studied him for a long moment. Then his expression shifted to dismissive contempt. "You heard it mentioned and barely understood what it meant. The Talbot note isn't your concern. Don't speak of business matters you can't comprehend." "Yes, sir." "I apologize, sir." "Get out." Isaiah left quickly, carrying the tray, his face showing appropriate contrition. But the seed was planted. Hale would now spend the next several days thinking about the widow Talbot's note, a relatively minor debt that was, in fact, due in September. The same month Pike would return to inspect the cotton crop. Hale would remember that Pike had mentioned the Jackson Bank's aggressive foreclosure schedule. He would begin to feel the walls closing in, even though nothing had actually changed except his awareness of the timeline. And when men felt pressured, they made mistakes. This pattern repeated through the summer and into fall. Not with Pike specifically, but with other visitors, other conversations. Isaiah would clean the study during business meetings. He would serve meals when plantation owners gathered to discuss markets. He would run errands that put him in position to overhear crucial information. And occasionally, not often enough to seem deliberate, but frequently enough to have effect, he would ask seemingly innocent questions that prompted men to explain things, to justify decisions, to reveal information they'd otherwise keep private. By November, 2 creditors had begun asking Hale for updated financial statements. By December, a third had sent a formal letter requesting confirmation of cotton delivery schedules for the coming year. The pressure was building, slowly, naturally, exactly as Isaiah had planned. The church stood at the center of Coldwater, Mississippi, a white-painted structure with a bell tower that could be heard across 3 plantations when Sunday services began. The pews filled according to strict hierarchy, wealthy plantation owners in front, merchants and tradesmen in the middle, overseers, and poor whites toward the back. Enslaved people stood in a separate section at the rear, behind a wooden partition that allowed them to hear the sermon but kept them properly separated from white congregants. Isaiah attended every Sunday because Mrs. Hale insisted the house servants accompany the family. He stood in the designated area, hands clasped, eyes forward, his face arranged in an expression of appropriate religious attention. Pastor Wycliffe was mid-sermon, speaking about the parable of the talents, with the particular emphasis Southern preachers gave to passages about faithful servants and divine hierarchy. Isaiah had heard variations of this sermon dozens of times. The message was always the same. God ordained the social order, and those who served faithfully in their appointed station would receive heavenly reward. Isaiah's attention wasn't on the sermon. It was on the conversations happening in whispers between hymns, during the moments when the congregation stood or sat, when people shifted positions and leaned close to their neighbors to exchange quiet words. 2 rows ahead, plantation owner Robert Gaines murmured something to his wife. Isaiah couldn't hear the exact words, but he watched Mrs. Gaines's eyes flick toward where Edmund Hale sat with his family in the 3rd pew. Her expression suggested concern, perhaps pity. Behind Gaines, merchant Thomas Crawford bent toward his business partner. Their heads came together briefly before separating. Crawford's gaze also found Hale, though his expression was harder to read, calculation rather than sympathy. The sermon concluded. The congregation rose for the final hymn. As voices lifted in song, Isaiah observed the subtle social dynamics that revealed so much more than words. Several men who would normally greet Hale after service were positioning themselves to exit through different doors. Conversations formed in clusters that deliberately excluded the Hale family. When the hymn ended and people began filing out, Isaiah followed the Hales at the proper distance for a house servant. He watched as Edmund Hale attempted to engage Robert Gaines in conversation on the church steps. "Gaines, I wanted to discuss that irrigation system you installed last spring. I'm considering something similar for the South Fields." Gaines turned, and his smile was polite but cool. "It's been effective. Speak with my overseer. He can provide the details." The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable. Gaines moved away before Hale could continue the conversation, immediately engaging a different planter in animated discussion. Hale's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained confident as he turned to greet the next person, Thomas Crawford, who was approaching with his partner. "Hale," Crawford acknowledged with a brief nod. "Crawford, I trust business remains strong?" "Variable. The market requires careful attention these days." Crawford's tone was professionally neutral, but his eyes were evaluating. "I heard the Jackson Bank sent inquiries to several plantations last week. Routine financial reviews, apparently." Hale's confidence didn't waver. "Standard practice. Nothing concerning." "Of course." Crawford's smile was thin. "Though I also heard they're requiring updated cotton projections from anyone carrying notes above a certain threshold. Just ensuring their investments remain sound. Black Cypress's projections are excellent." "I'm sure they are." Crawford nodded again and moved past, his partner following without a word. Isaiah stood near the wagon, holding the position expected of him, but his attention tracked every interaction. He watched the widow Talbot speak briefly with Mrs. Hale, mentioning her son's upcoming marriage and the expense of setting up a new household. He observed the way Pastor Wycliffe's greeting to Hale was fractionally shorter than his greeting to other prominent families. The doubt was spreading exactly as he'd anticipated. Not aggressive accusation, but careful distancing. The community was beginning to wonder about Black Cypress's stability, to question whether Edmund Hale's confident presentation matched his actual financial position. And Hale's response was exactly what Isaiah expected. He grew more confident, more assured, more determined to project strength. On the ride home, Hale spoke to his wife about expanding the cotton acreage for next season, about purchasing new equipment, about hosting a social gathering to demonstrate Black Cypress's prosperity. Mrs. Hale listened with the patient silence of a woman who'd learned not to question her husband's business decisions. Isaiah sat on the wagon bench behind them, face blank, hands folded. Inside, he felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction. The emotion was more complex, darker. He was watching a man respond to pressure by making himself more vulnerable, by committing to expenses he couldn't afford, by doubling down on the same pride and arrogance that were destroying him. And no one could see Isaiah's hand in any of it. That evening, after supper was cleared and the Hales retired to the parlor, Isaiah was cleaning the dining room when he heard raised voices from the study. He moved quietly down the hall, positioning himself near the partially open door. "Damned incompetence!" Hale's voice carried sharp anger. The accounts should have been reconciled a week ago. The overseer, a man named Victor Cobb, responded with defensive frustration. The field hands are behind on their quotas. Time spent on paperwork means time not spent supervising. Then supervise better. I don't pay you to make excuses. A moment of tense silence followed. Then Hale's voice came again, colder now. Starting tomorrow, reduce rations for anyone who doesn't meet their daily picking quota. And I want stricter discipline. These people have gotten comfortable. They need to remember their place. Isaiah's hands tightened on the cloth he was holding. His face remained expressionless, but something shifted in his chest, a cold weight settling deeper. He'd known this would happen. Knew that when Hale felt threatened, he would grasp for control through cruelty. But knowing it intellectually was different from hearing the order spoken aloud, from understanding that people he'd known his entire life would suffer because of pressure Isaiah himself had helped create. Cobb's voice came again, uncertain. Sir, reduced rations might affect productivity. It will affect their attitude, which will affect productivity positively. Now, get out. Footsteps approached. Isaiah moved away from the door, returning to the dining room before Cobb emerged from the study. He continued cleaning with steady, mechanical movements, while his mind worked through the implication. The harsher discipline would cause suffering, but it would also increase resentment, create instability, potentially drive skilled workers to attempt escape, all of which would further damage the plantation's operation. The system was eating itself. Isaiah had known it would. That night, he lay on his thin mattress in the small room off the kitchen, staring at darkness while the house settled around him. Downstairs, he could hear the muffled sounds of the overseer implementing Hale's orders. Angry voices, the crack of a whip against the side of a barn as warning, someone crying. Isaiah listened, remembered, added it to the careful accounting he kept in his mind. The plantation would fall. He would make certain of it. And when it did, every act of cruelty, every reduction in rations, every moment of suffering would be part of the justification he carried inside himself for what he was doing. The morning arrived like any other. Isaiah woke before dawn, dressed in the dim light, and began his daily routine. He carried water from the well, helped prepare breakfast, swept the front hallway while the Hales ate. Everything appeared normal. The house operated according to its usual rhythms. But when the breakfast dishes were cleared and Mrs. Hale called for Isaiah to attend her in the parlor, something in her tone made his chest tighten. He entered the room with his customary careful steps. Mrs. Hale sat in her preferred chair near the window, embroidery in her lap, though her hands weren't moving. Her expression held a peculiar mixture of regret and resignation, the look of someone who'd accepted an unpleasant necessity. Isaiah, she said quietly, go fetch Sarah from the kitchen house. Tell her to come here immediately. Sarah. The name hit him like a physical blow, though he allowed nothing to show on his face. Yes, ma'am, he said, and left the room with steady steps that gave no indication of the sudden chaos inside his mind. He crossed the yard to the kitchen house where Sarah worked. She was 15, a year older than Isaiah, with quick hands and a quicker smile that she saved for moments when white eyes weren't watching. They'd grown up together, shared the same small corner of the world, developed a connection that existed in glances, and brief words exchanged when no one was paying attention. She looked up when he entered, her hands covered in flour from the biscuits she was preparing for the noon meal. Mrs. Hale wants you in the parlor, Isaiah said. His voice came out flat, controlled. Sarah's smile faded. She'd lived in this place long enough to know that sudden summons meant changes, and changes were rarely good. She wiped her hands on her apron, fear flickering across her face, before she hid it behind careful blankness. They walked back across the yard together. Isaiah wanted to say something, to warn her somehow, but there were eyes everywhere. Other servants, an overseer near the barn, Mrs. Hale visible through the parlor window. Any conversation would be noted, questioned. So they walked in silence. Mrs. Hale looked up when they entered. "Sarah," she said with that same regretful tone, "you're being sold this afternoon. A gentleman from Vicksburg is purchasing several workers. You'll go with him when he leaves." The words landed between them like stones dropped in still water. Sarah's face went completely still. "Ma'am?" "Mr. Hale has made the arrangements. You'll have time to gather your belongings, such as they are. Be ready by noon." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah's voice was barely audible. Mrs. Hale returned her attention to her embroidery, the dismissal clear. Isaiah and Sarah left the parlor. They walked back toward the kitchen house, and Isaiah felt something cracking inside his chest. A fissure spreading through the careful control he maintained constantly. When they reached the kitchen house, Sarah stopped. Her hands were shaking. "Isaiah," she whispered, and her voice broke on his name. He looked at her, really looked, for perhaps the first time in months. While he'd been focused on ledgers and debts and the careful architecture of destruction, Sarah had been here, a real person with fears and hopes. Someone who'd shown him small kindnesses when kindness was dangerous, who'd saved him extra food when supplies ran short, who'd covered for him when he spent too long listening at doors. Someone who mattered. "I don't want to go," she said, and tears were forming in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. "I don't know what happens there. I don't know who. I know." The words came out rougher than he intended. "Will you—" She stopped, searching for words that might matter, might change anything. "Will you remember me?" The question destroyed something inside him, as if he could forget, as if his memory, his greatest weapon and deepest curse, would allow him to forget anything. "Yes," he said. She nodded, wiped her eyes quickly, aware that showing too much emotion could bring punishment. "I should pack." Isaiah watched her gather the few items she owned. An extra dress, a wooden comb, a small cloth bag containing things he couldn't see. The accumulation of a lifetime fit into a bundle she could carry in one hand. By noon, a wagon arrived. The buyer was a thin man with cold eyes who examined Sarah like livestock, checking her teeth, her hands, asking brief questions about her skills. Edmund Hale stood nearby, counting the money exchanged with visible satisfaction. Isaiah stood near the house, positioned where he was supposed to be, hands at his sides. He watched Sarah climb into the wagon with 3 other people he barely knew. Field workers he'd seen from a distance but never spoken to. The wagon pulled away. Sarah looked back once, her eyes finding his across the yard. Then she turned forward, and the wagon rolled down the long drive toward the road. Isaiah stood motionless. Inside, something was shifting. The careful calculations, the patient planning, the intellectual exercise of dismantling a system, all of it collided with the raw fact of Sarah's absence. He'd known this would happen, had understood intellectually that Hale would sell people to cover debts, but knowing it abstractly was different from watching it occur, from losing someone who mattered. For a moment, brief and dangerous, he questioned everything, wondered if his actions had accelerated this, if his manipulation had forced Hale's hand sooner than it might have come naturally. Then the moment passed. Because the alternative was accepting that the system was inevitable, that people would be sold regardless of what he did, that powerlessness was the only option available to him. Sarah was gone, but the plantation still stood. Hale still profited. The system still functioned. Not for much longer. Isaiah turned away from the empty road. His face was blank, his movements controlled, his appearance unremarkable to anyone who might be watching. But inside, in the private space where he kept his calculations and his rage and his absolute determination, something hardened into final resolution. He would finish what he'd started. Not despite what happened to Sarah, but because of it. The plantation would fall completely, and every person who'd participated in its operation would face consequences they couldn't imagine. Isaiah walked back toward the house, ready to continue his work. 3 years had passed since Sarah's departure. Isaiah was 18 now, taller but still unremarkable in appearance, still performing his duties with the same careful slowness that had protected him since childhood. Black Cypress Plantation was dying. Anyone with eyes could see it. Fields produced less each season. Creditors visited more frequently. Edmund Hale's face had grown haggard, his sermons more desperate, his temper more volatile. But the final proof, the evidence that would transform suspicion into legal action, remained locked inside ledgers that only Isaiah truly understood. Until the morning Isaiah decided it was time. He was cleaning the study, as he'd done countless times before. Edmund Hale sat at his desk, going through correspondence with increasing agitation. Bills, demands for payment, letters from business partners questioning his accounts. "Isaiah," Hale said without looking up, "I need these papers organized. Sort them by date, then take the older ones to the storage room." "Yes, sir." Isaiah gathered the papers carefully. Among them was a contract from 4 years prior, a cotton futures agreement that Hale had partially fulfilled, then falsified the completion records to claim full payment. The document itself was unremarkable, but paired with recent delivery receipts, it would reveal the discrepancy clearly. Isaiah had known about this document for years, had memorized its contents, understood its implications, waited for the precise moment when it would matter most. That moment had arrived. He sorted the papers as instructed. But when he reached the storage room, he placed the contract not in the locked cabinet where it belonged, but in a box of materials scheduled for review by the county tax assessor the following week. The assessor's visit was routine, expected, normal. Nothing about it would raise suspicion. Isaiah returned to his duties. 1 week later, County Assessor Thomas Garrett arrived with his usual leather case and methodical manner. He was a thin man who loved numbers more than people, who found errors the way hunting dogs found quail. Mrs. Hale offered him tea. He declined politely and requested access to financial records for the standard property assessment. Edmund Hale provided the main ledgers without concern. These documents had been carefully maintained, presented a picture of modest profit and manageable debt. But when Garrett began cross-referencing supporting documents, the routine verification that good assessors performed, he found the cotton futures contract in the review box. Isaiah was polishing silverware in the dining room when he heard Garrett's voice shift tone. "Mr. Hale, I have a question about this contract." "Which one?" "The Pemberton Cotton Agreement from 1854. A pause. Then Hale's voice, carefully neutral. "What about it?" "The contract states delivery of 400 bales. Your records show payment received for 400 bales. But the corresponding warehouse receipts I reviewed last month only document 270 bales delivered." Another pause, longer this time. "There must be a filing error," Hale said. "Multiple shipments, perhaps recorded separately." "Perhaps," Garrett agreed. "I'll need to verify with the Pemberton Company directly." Isaiah continued polishing silverware, his hands steady, his expression unchanged. Garrett left that afternoon with several documents for verification. Edmund Hale watched him go with visible tension, then retreated to his study and didn't emerge for dinner. 2 weeks passed. Isaiah maintained his routines, performed his duties, observed everything. Then Garrett returned, this time with a representative from the Pemberton Cotton Company and a county clerk. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Voices rose occasionally, though Isaiah couldn't make out specific words from his position in the hallway. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what they were finding. The same discrepancies he'd discovered years ago, now surfacing through proper legal channels. When the visitors left, Edmund Hale was pale and shaking. Over the following weeks, the consequences multiplied like cracks spreading through ice. The Pemberton Company filed a formal complaint of fraud. Other business partners, alerted to the investigation, began reviewing their own contracts with renewed scrutiny. More discrepancies surfaced. Not all of them. Isaiah had been selective, choosing only those that would be discovered through normal auditing procedures, nothing that would suggest deliberate exposure. The bank that held Hale's primary loan demanded immediate review of all collateral. Church leaders quietly distanced themselves from a man facing fraud allegations. Insurance companies questioned previous claims. Each revelation led to another investigation. Each investigation uncovered more irregularities. The system Isaiah had studied so carefully was doing exactly what he'd known it would do, devouring one of its own members the moment they appeared weak. Edmund Hale hired a lawyer, argued that the errors were honest mistakes, accounting oversights, the result of trusted employees failing their duties. But the numbers didn't support his claims. The pattern was too clear, too consistent. Isaiah watched it all unfold with quiet attention. He fetched water, carried messages, cleaned rooms, remained invisible while everything collapsed around him. 6 weeks after Garrett's initial discovery, the county judge issued a warrant for Edmund Hale's arrest on charges of fraud and false representation in business contracts. The morning the authorities arrived, Isaiah was sweeping the front porch. 2 county deputies rode up the drive, accompanied by Sheriff Caleb Morton. Behind them came a wagon carrying a court clerk and several assistants. Edmund Hale met them at the door, his face a mixture of outrage and fear. "This is absurd," he protested. "I'm a respected member of this community, a church elder. You can't—" "Mr. Edmund Hale," Sheriff Morton interrupted, his voice formal and carrying across the yard, "you are under arrest for fraud in business dealings, false representation of goods delivered, and conspiracy to defraud creditors. You will come with us immediately." Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. The court clerk began reading from a document, listing charges, explaining legal procedures. Behind the authorities, more people were arriving: creditors, representatives from various companies, county officials. Isaiah continued sweeping, his movements steady and unremarkable. Edmund Hale was placed in the wagon. His protests grew louder, more desperate, but the law had already decided. The deputies began securing the property, preparing for the seizure proceedings that would follow. Isaiah set the broom aside and stepped back into the house, ready to continue his work, while the world he'd carefully dismantled finally, officially, completely fell apart. The crowd grew throughout the morning. Word traveled fast in a small county. News of Edmund Hale's arrest drew spectators like vultures to carrion. Merchants he owed money, neighbors who'd always suspected something wasn't right, churchgoers curious to see a respected elder brought low. By mid-morning, perhaps 30 people had gathered outside Black Cypress Plantation, forming loose clusters in the yard and along the drive. They spoke in hushed voices, watching as county officials moved in and out of the big house with ledgers and documents. Isaiah remained near the kitchen entrance, observing. No one paid him attention. Enslaved people were expected to watch in silence during moments like these, invisible witnesses to white affairs. Sheriff Morton stood on the front porch, organizing the seizure with methodical efficiency. He'd brought 4 deputies, 2 clerks, and a court-appointed assessor to catalog property and verify debts. Edmund Hale sat in the wagon, his hands bound, his face red with rage and humiliation. The crowd kept a respectful distance from him, but their eyes never left his figure. "This is a mistake," Hale shouted for perhaps the 10th time. "When my lawyer reviews these documents, you'll see. Accounting errors? Nothing more. I've done nothing criminal." Sheriff Morton didn't respond. He'd heard similar protests before. One of the clerks emerged from the house carrying a stack of ledgers. Behind him came Assessor Garrett, his expression grim and satisfied. "Sheriff," Garrett called, You should see this. Morton descended the porch steps and met Garrett halfway across the yard. They spoke quietly, but Isaiah's position allowed him to hear fragments. 3 separate contracts claimed full payment, but warehouse receipts don't match. Morton's jaw tightened. He glanced back at Hale, then nodded to Garrett. A merchant from town, a man named Vernon who supplied dry goods, stepped forward from the crowd. "Sheriff, if you're cataloging debts, Mr. Hale owes my store $118. Been overdue 4 months." "Noted," one of the clerks said, making a record. Another voice rose from the crowd. "He owes me for carpentry work, $42, and me for grain delivery, $67. The claims multiplied. People who'd stayed quiet when Hale seemed powerful now found courage in his powerlessness. Each debt was recorded, added to the growing total that would be weighed against the plantation's remaining value. Edmund Hale's face grew darker with each claim. "You vultures," he spat, circling before the body's even cold. "I'll pay every cent when this misunderstanding is resolved." "It's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Hale," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the yard. "The evidence is quite clear." "What evidence? Mistakes in paperwork? That's not fraud. That's multiple contracts showing full payment received for partial delivery," Garrett interrupted. "Warehouse receipts that don't match your ledgers. Insurance claims for cotton that was never damaged. Bills of sale for equipment you no longer possess, but never reported as sold." The crowd murmured. These weren't simple errors. This was systematic deception. Hale's lawyer, a nervous young man named Charles Whitmore, arrived in a hired carriage. He rushed to the wagon, speaking urgently with his client. Isaiah watched them confer, watched Whitmore's expression shift from confident to concerned as Hale explained the situation. Sheriff Morton allowed them 10 minutes, then interrupted. "Mr. Whitmore, your client can present his defense at the hearing. Right now, we're executing a lawful seizure." "On what grounds?" Whitmore demanded, though his voice lacked conviction. "Fraud, false representation, conspiracy to defraud creditors." Morton gestured to the house. "The evidence is documented. Judge Carson has reviewed it personally." Whitmore opened his mouth to protest, then seemed to deflate. He'd seen enough cases to recognize when the law had already decided. Inside the wagon, Edmund Hale's composure finally cracked. "This is persecution," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I've served this community for 20 years, built this plantation from nothing. And you're destroying me over accounting discrepancies?" "You destroyed yourself, Mr. Hale," Garrett said quietly. "I've done nothing different than any other planter in this county. We all manage our books to survive. The cotton market is unpredictable. The loans are impossible. The other planters don't falsify delivery records," Morton interrupted. "They don't claim payment for goods never provided. They don't lie to insurance companies." Hale's face twisted. "You think I'm the only one? You think this system runs on honesty? It's all lies, all of it. The banks lie about interest rates. The merchants lie about prices. The cotton buyers lie about quality assessments. I'm just doing what everyone does to survive." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. There was truth in Hale's words, even if it didn't excuse his actions. "Maybe so," Morton said. "But you're the one who got caught." The simple statement hung in the air. Hale stared at the sheriff, then at the crowd, then at his plantation. The big house, the fields beyond, the quarters where enslaved people watched silently. His shoulders sagged. The fight drained from his body like water from cracked pottery. "I want to speak to my wife," he said quietly. Morton nodded to a deputy, who escorted Mrs. Hale from the house. She approached the wagon with tears streaming down her face. Their conversation was brief and private. Isaiah couldn't hear the words, but he saw Mrs. Hale's hand reach through the wagon slats to grip her husband's, saw her shake her head, devastated, but not surprised. When they finished, Morton gave the signal. The wagon rolled forward, carrying Edmund Hale toward town, toward jail, toward a trial that would strip away everything he'd built on lies. The court clerk mounted the porch steps and raised his voice to address the crowd. By order of County Judge Samuel Carson, Black Cypress Plantation is hereby seized pending resolution of creditor claims and criminal proceedings. All property, including land, structures, equipment, livestock, and human chattel, is now under court supervision. He produced an official document, affixed with the county seal, and nailed it to the front door. The crowd pressed forward to read it, confirming what they'd just witnessed. Black Cypress Plantation had officially fallen. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of Mercy Creek, a free black settlement 30 miles north of the Mississippi border. A simple building, wood-framed with whitewashed walls and 6 windows that let in morning light. Inside, 12 children sat at rough-hewn desks, ranging in age from 6 to 14. They bent over slate boards, copying letters and numbers with careful concentration. At the front of the room stood a man in his late 20s. Lean build, average height, unremarkable features. He wore a simple brown suit, well-maintained but showing wear at the cuffs. His name was Marcus Webb. At least, that's what everyone in Mercy Creek knew him as. "Remember," he said, his voice calm and measured, "addition is finding the total. When you add 3 apples to 5 apples, you have 8 apples total." He wrote the numbers on the board. The process stays the same, whether you're counting apples, pennies, or bales of cotton. A girl named Sarah, perhaps 10 years old, raised her hand. "Mr. Webb, my mama says I don't need to know numbers, says I just need to know enough to keep from being cheated at market." Marcus paused, set down his chalk, turned to face the class. "Your mama is partly right," he said. "Knowing numbers keeps you from being cheated. But it also shows you how systems work, how money moves, how debts are calculated, how people in power justify their power." He walked between the desks, hands clasped behind his back. "Reading shows you what people say. Numbers show you what they do. Both are necessary if you want to understand the world." Sarah considered this, then nodded and returned to her slate. Marcus continued the lesson for another hour, covering basic arithmetic, then moved to reading practice. Each student took turns reading aloud from a primer, simple stories about families, farms, and daily life. When they stumbled over words, Marcus corrected gently. When they succeeded, he offered quiet encouragement. Nothing about his teaching suggested brilliance. He was patient, thorough, competent. The kind of teacher who got results through steady effort rather than exceptional talent. At midday, the students ate lunch outside while Marcus remained in the schoolhouse, reviewing their morning work. He made notes on each student's progress, identifying areas needing reinforcement. The door opened. Reverend Thomas entered, an elderly man who'd helped establish Mercy Creek after purchasing his freedom 30 years prior. "Marcus," he greeted, taking a seat at one of the student desks. "How are they progressing?" "Steadily," Marcus replied. "Sarah is struggling with subtraction, but her reading improves daily. Daniel grasps numbers quickly, but rushes through writing. Overall, they're learning." Reverend Thomas smiled. "You're good with them. Patient. Some teachers get frustrated when children learn slowly. Children learn at their own pace," Marcus said. Frustration doesn't accelerate understanding. They discussed school matters for a while. The need for new primers, a family considering enrollment, repairs needed on the roof before winter. Then Reverend Thomas leaned back, studying Marcus with the perceptive gaze of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "You never talk about where you came from," he observed. "Most folks who settle here share their stories eventually. How they got free, where they were before. But you keep yours close." Marcus continued organizing papers, his expression unchanged. "The past is behind me. I prefer focusing on what's ahead." "That's a reasonable philosophy," Thomas acknowledged. but it also suggests the past holds pain worth avoiding. Marcus looked up then, meeting the Reverend's eyes directly. Everyone here carries pain, Reverend. We all survived things that shouldn't be survived. I don't see value in comparing scars. Thomas nodded slowly. Fair enough. Just know that if you ever want to share the weight, the church is always open. I appreciate that. After Thomas left, Marcus returned to his work. He maintained the same careful routine every day, teaching, reviewing lessons, preparing materials for tomorrow. In the evenings, he helped manage the settlement's cooperative store, keeping ledgers and tracking inventory. People knew him as reliable, private, intelligent, but not exceptionally so. A man who'd found freedom and built a quiet life around education and community service. No one questioned his past too deeply. Most residents of Mercy Creek carried histories they preferred to keep buried. On Saturday afternoons, Marcus offered additional tutoring for adults learning to read. Men and women who'd spent their lives enslaved, now free and determined to master skills previously denied them. An older woman named Helen attended regularly. She worked as a seamstress, successful enough to support herself, but she wanted to read contracts and write correspondence without depending on others. Mr. Webb, she said one afternoon, struggling through a passage. How did you learn all this? Reading, numbers, everything. Marcus kept his eyes on her primer, carefully, over time. Same way you're learning now. But you must have had good teaching. Someone who took time with you. I learned from watching, from listening, from paying attention to how people used information. He turned the page. Continue with the next paragraph. Helen read aloud, slowly but accurately. When she finished, Marcus nodded approval. You're progressing well. Another few months, you'll be reading full documents without assistance. She beamed with pride. That evening, after everyone left, Marcus sat alone in the schoolhouse. The setting sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting the empty desks in amber light. He pulled out a worn journal, its pages filled with careful notations, records of student progress, lesson plans, observations about teaching methods. He added today's notes, his handwriting precise and economical. Then he closed the journal and returned it to a locked drawer. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember. Fragments of a different life. A big house he'd cleaned. Conversations he'd overheard. Numbers he'd memorized. A system he'd understood better than those who thought they controlled it. But only for a moment. Marcus Webb stood, straightened the desks, and prepared the room for Monday's lessons. The past was behind him. The future was these children, learning to read and calculate, preparing to navigate a world that would try to limit them at every turn. He extinguished the lamps and locked the schoolhouse door. 2 towns over, in a general store, a traveling salesman told a story to the proprietor. Heard the strangest thing down in Mississippi, he said, leaning on the counter. Whole plantation collapsed years back. Owner went to prison for fraud, but folks still talk about it. Fraud's not that unusual, the proprietor replied, tallying receipts. No, but the way it happened was. No violence, no fire, nothing obvious. Just gradually fell apart from the inside. The salesman lowered his voice. Some people say it was a slave boy who did it. Couldn't have been more than 18, 19 when it all came down. Smartest person anyone had ever seen. How would a slave boy bring down a plantation? The salesman shrugged. Nobody knows. That's what makes it a good story. Some say he could remember every number he ever heard. Others say he understood money better than the bankers. Most say it's just legend. Probably is, the proprietor agreed. Probably, the salesman echoed. Still, makes you wonder, if it's true, where'd a boy like that end up? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Outside, the world continued as it always had. The truth remained buried, known only to one man who'd chosen to let it stay that way. I hope you found that story powerful. leave a like on the video, and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.